The wind coming off the river Avon carried the scent of wet limestone and damp earth. I stood at the base of the ruined tower at Malmesbury Abbey, running my bare hand over the coarse, 12th century masonry. The stone was cold. It was the second Tuesday in November. I had come to Wiltshire to trace the path of an expedition that lasted less than 15 seconds. In the early 11th century, a Benedictine monk named Eilmer strapped a framework of wood and parchment to his limbs and stepped off the highest point of this hill. He intended to navigate the air. He was the first recorded man in England to attempt such a voyage. The flight ended in shattered bone and a silence that has lasted 1,000. The records of the 11th century are sparse, written on heavy vellum with iron gall ink that fades to a rust-colored brown over the centuries. To understand the expedition of the monk Eilmer, I first had to understand the environment that produced him. Malmesbury Abbey in the year 1010 was not merely a place of prayer, it was a center of intense, methodical study. The monks here were engaged in the quadrivium, the medieval curriculum that included arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. They measured the movement of the stars with brass astrolabes and calculated the shifting dates of Easter using complex mathematical tables. Eilmer was a product of this exactitude. He was a man accustomed to observing the physical world and attempting to quantify its rules. I spent 3 days in the archives reading through the surviving catalogues of monastic libraries from the period. They contained texts on mechanics, the properties of wind, and the behavior of the natural world. Eilmer would have had access to the classical myth of Daedalus, but the evidence suggests he viewed flight not as a myth, but as an engineering problem to be solved. He spent his time observing the jackdaws and rooks that nested in the high stone crevices of the abbey. I watched these same birds circle the ruins during my visit. They utilized the thermal currents rising from the steep hill on which the abbey sits, banking and turning with minute adjustments of their primary feathers. Eilmer watched them too. He noted the ratio of their wingspan to their body weight. He observed how they achieved lift by facing into the prevailing winds. The historical record, set down a century later by the historian William of Malmesbury, states plainly that Eilmer believed the fable of Daedalus was a practical reality. He did not rely on prayer or divine intervention to lift him from the earth. He relied on mathematics, the study of air currents, and the physical construction of a lifting surface. He was, in every measurable sense, an aeronautical engineer operating in the Dark Ages. His expedition was planned within the quiet, cold walls of the scriptorium, surrounded by the smell of damp parchment and the scratching of quills. He calculated the surface area required to support a man weighing perhaps 150 pounds. He calculated the necessary strength of the framework. He kept his work quiet, likely aware that his superiors might view an attempt to conquer the air as a violation of the natural order established by God. The planning phase of his journey was entirely solitary. The physical construction of Eilmer's apparatus required materials that could be sourced within the abbey's grounds or the surrounding Wiltshire countryside. I visited a traditional woodworker in a village 3 miles from Malmesbury to examine the timber that would have been available in the year 1010. The primary requirement for a glider frame is a high strength-to-weight ratio. Oak is too heavy. Pine is too brittle. The most logical choice, and the one most readily available to an 11th century monk, was ash. Ash wood is highly flexible, resistant to impact, and was commonly used for tool handles and spear shafts. Eilmer would have needed long, straight lengths of ash to form the leading edges of his wings. For the ribs, he likely used willow, harvested from the banks of the river Avon at the bottom of the hill. Willow can be bent into cambered shapes when steamed, providing the necessary airfoil curve to generate lift. The covering of the wings presents a more difficult question. Silk was exceedingly rare and expensive. Canvas was heavy. The most probable materials were either tightly woven linen, treated with animal fat or wax to make it impermeable to the air, or large sheets of thin parchment. I examined a sheet of 11th century parchment in the archives. It is remarkably strong, but heavy. If he used linen, he would have had to stretch it taut over the ash and willow frame, securing it with hide glue and tight bindings of sinew or leather. The historical text specifies that he fastened the wings to his hands and feet. This indicates he did not build a rigid, fixed-wing glider in the modern sense, but rather an articulated structure, perhaps resembling the wings of a bat, which he controlled by extending his arms and legs. The physical labor of building this apparatus would have been immense. He had to forge or purchase iron buckles and rivets. He had to cut and tan leather straps thick enough to bear his entire body weight, without snapping under the sudden tension of flight. I calculated the weight of such an apparatus. Even using the lightest available ash and linen, the wings would have weighed between 30 and 40 pounds. The wingspan required to support his weight would have been at least 20 feet from tip to tip. Assembling this structure in secret would have been nearly impossible. He must have worked in the Abbey's carpentry sheds, perhaps disguising the components as parts for a windmill or a theatrical prop for a religious mystery play. The exact dimensions, the method of joining the wood, and the tensioning of the fabric are entirely lost to history. All that is known. The launch site for the expedition was the tower of the Saxon Church of St. Mary, which stood on the grounds of Malmesbury Abbey. The original Saxon structure is entirely gone, replaced by the later Norman abbey whose ruins stand today. However, archaeological surveys and historical descriptions allow us to estimate the height of Eilmer's launch point. The Saxon tower stood approximately 24 meters, or nearly 80 feet, above the ground. The abbey itself is situated on a steep limestone promontory that drops sharply down to the River Avon. This topography is crucial. By launching from the tower, Eilmer was not just gaining 80 feet of altitude. He was launching into the updrafts created as the prevailing southwesterly winds hit the steep face of the hill. I climbed the narrow, spiral stone staircase of the surviving Norman tower to understand the physical reality of the ascent. The stairs are barely 2 feet wide. The stone is worn smooth and slick with moisture. Carrying a 20-foot, 40-pound ash and linen apparatus up a similar staircase in the 11th century would have required immense physical strength and careful maneuvering. He likely had to carry the wings up in sections and assemble them on the open parapet at the top. The date of the flight is unrecorded, but the meteorological conditions required for such an attempt dictate a day with strong, steady headwinds. He needed the wind to generate airflow over the wings before he even stepped off the stone. I stood on the roof of the abbey and looked down at the ground. 80 feet is a lethal drop. The wind at that altitude is loud, drowning out the sounds of the town below. Eilmer had to strap the heavy leather bindings to his wrists and ankles. He had to test the tension of the linen. He had to position his body facing directly into the wind. The historical record provides no details of his final moments on the tower. There is no record of a crowd gathering, no mention of the abbot attempting to stop him. It is entirely possible he made the ascent at dawn, before the rest of the monastery had broken their silence. He stood on the edge of the dressed stone. He extended his arms and legs, pulling the fabric taut. The wind would have caught the wings immediately, pulling at his shoulders, threatening to drag him backward over the roof. To fly, he had to lean forward, fighting the drag. And the moment Eilmer left the stone, he ceased to be a monk and became a pilot. Gravity immediately took hold, pulling him downward. In those first 2 seconds, he would have dropped perhaps 30 feet, accelerating rapidly. This drop was necessary. He needed airspeed to generate lift. As his velocity increased, the wind caught the cambered surface of his linen wings. The tension on the leather straps binding his wrists and ankles would have been immense, transferring the entire weight of his falling body onto the ash wood frame. The wood held. The fabric did not tear. The historical record is explicit on this point. He did not plummet straight down. He flew. William of Malmesbury records that Eilmer glided for a distance of more than a furlong. A furlong is 220 yards, or roughly 201 meters. I took a surveyor's measuring wheel and walked exactly 201 meters from the base of the abbey tower, following the trajectory of the prevailing wind. The path crosses the modern churchyard, passes over a low stone wall, and descends the steep slope toward the river. To cover this distance from an initial height of 80 feet, Eilmer's glider must have had a glide ratio of at least 1:8. This is a remarkable aerodynamic achievement for the 11th century. For perhaps 10 to 15 seconds, he was in sustained, heavier-than-air flight. He was moving forward at a speed I estimate to be around 30 miles per hour. He was looking down at the slate roofs of the town and the green water of the Avon. But the apparatus had a fatal design flaw. While he had successfully engineered a lifting surface, he had failed to engineer a stabilizing surface. He had no tail. In modern aerodynamics, an empennage, the tail assembly, is required to maintain pitch stability. Without it, a glider is highly susceptible to shifts in the center of pressure. As Eilmer flew outward from the hill, he crossed the boundary layer of the updraft. The chronicle states that he was agitated by the violence of the wind and the swirling of air. He hit turbulence. Without a tail to correct his pitch, the nose of his glider likely pitched upward sharply in a gust. The wings lost their angle of attack. The airflow separated from the linen surface. The glider stalled. The lift vanished instantly, and the flight ended in the soft, damp soil of the lower hill. The exact velocity of the impact cannot be calculated without knowing the precise altitude at which the stall occurred, but the medical evidence recorded in the chronicle tells a clear story of the crash. A free fall from 80 feet is almost universally fatal. The fact that Eilmer survived indicates that his wings, even in a stalled condition, provided enough drag to slow his descent significantly. He did not hit the ground at terminal velocity. However, he hit the ground hard enough to shatter the bones in his lower extremities. The chronicle states that he broke both his legs. Given the mechanics of a feet-first or angled impact, these were likely severe fractures of the tibia and fibula, possibly compound fractures where the bone breaches the skin. The pain would have been immediate and blinding. The ashwood frame of the glider would have splintered on impact, the linen tearing, the heavy leather straps pulling his dislocated joints. The silence of the morning was broken by the crash and the aftermath. The other monks of the abbey, either having witnessed the flight or hearing the impact, rushed down the steep hill to the crash site. They found Eilmer tangled in the wreckage of his machine. The medical care available in the year 1010 was rudimentary. They would have carried his broken body back up the hill on a makeshift litter of wooden boards or heavy wool blankets. In the abbey infirmary, the infirmarian would have set the shattered bones by hand, without the aid of modern anesthetics. They may have given him a tincture of willow bark to dull the agony, but the process of aligning the tibia and binding it in tight linen bandages and wooden splints would have been excruciating. Eilmer survived the shock and the subsequent risk of infection, which in itself is a testament to his physical constitution. But the damage was permanent. The bones did not heal cleanly. He was left lame, walking with a pronounced limp for the rest of his long life. As for the glider, the physical remnants of the expedition were likely gathered up and destroyed. The splintered ashwood was probably burned in the abbey hearths. The linen was the physical evidence of the expedition vanished into the soil and the fires of Malmesbury, leaving only a textual trail. The entire basis for our knowledge of Eilmer's flight rests on a single manuscript, written more than a century after the event. I examined a facsimile of the Gesta Regum Anglorum, the Deeds of the Kings of the English, written by William of Malmesbury around the year 1125. William is widely regarded by historians as one of the most reliable and methodical chroniclers of the medieval period. He did not traffic in idle rumors. He sought out primary sources and eyewitness accounts whenever possible. William was a monk at the same abbey where Eilmer had flown. Eilmer lived to be a very old man, surviving well past the Norman conquest of 1066. William, writing in the early 12th century, almost certainly interviewed older monks who had known Eilmer personally in his final years. The Latin text is brief, comprising only a few sentences, but it is highly specific. William uses the phrase, Panis manus et pedes inexorat. He fastened wings to his hands and feet. He specifies the distance of the flight as spatium stadii et plus, a distance of a stadium, a furlong, and more. He records the exact nature of the injuries and Eilmer's own post-flight analysis. I searched the archives for any corroborating documents. I looked for abbey ledger entries recording the purchase of large quantities of linen or iron rivets in the first decade of the 11th century. I looked for marginalia in the surviving illuminated manuscripts that might show a sketch of a winged man. I found nothing. The archaeological record is equally silent. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the abbey grounds have revealed the foundations of the old Saxon church, but they cannot detect the decayed remnants of wood and cloth. If Eilmer dropped any iron buckles or rivets during his crash, they are buried under 1,000 years of accumulated topsoil, indistinguishable from the nails of medieval horseshoes or the iron fittings of decayed coffins. The investigation reaches a hard boundary here. The text is the only surviving artifact of the expedition. We are forced to rely on the meticulous nature of a 12th century historian to bear witness to the 11th century flight. The record is the most compelling piece of evidence regarding Aylmer's mindset comes from his own assessment of the crash. According to William's chronicle, Aylmer did not blame the wind, the materials, or the will of God for his broken legs. He blamed his own engineering. He stated that the cause of his fall was his failure to attach a tail to his hinder parts. He recognized, through the brutal physical feedback of the crash, the necessity of an empennage for longitudinal stability. He had solved the problem of lift, and in the aftermath, he solved the problem of control. He intended to fly again. The record indicates he began preparations to build a second, improved glider, incorporating the tail design. He was stopped by the abbot. The superior of the monastery forbade him from making any further attempts, likely viewing the first crash as a divine warning and a second attempt as a sin of pride. Bound by his monastic vow of obedience, Aylmer complied. He never built the second machine. He lived for another 50 years, walking the cloisters of Malmesbury with a heavy limp. In 1066, as an old man, he witnessed the appearance of Halley's comet, recording it as an omen of destruction shortly before the Norman invasion. He died and was buried in the abbey grounds, his grave unmarked and lost to time. The exact design of his wings, the precise method he used to bind them to his body, and the true aerodynamic profile of his invention went into the earth with him. We know he flew, but the architecture of his flight remains entirely unknown. If these stories of vanished crews, lost technology, and silent ships speak to you, subscribe to the Lost Atlas.